So hello everybody, welcome to my video on human motivation and self-determination theory. So let's start this video presentation with a question. And the question is, what do you think is the most common question that teachers ask during training or teachers ask other teachers? Well, I think probably the most common question is, how can I motivate my students? So we're going to look at that in this video. And we're going to use self-determination theory to look at this because it is a theory of human motivation. So it can also be used in the classroom. So the talk today is going to have 5 stages. First of all, we'll look at what self-determination theory is. Then we will look at the 3 core components of self-determination theory, which are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we will look at what they mean. And then finally, we will answer some questions about what claims self-determination theory makes from a scientific or theoretical point of view. In particular, we'll look at how and whether self-determination theory can improve motivation and performance. So let's get started by looking at self-determination theory and what it is. Self-determination theory is a theory of human motivation that aims to promote well-being and excellence. The theory can be used in any area of life, any domain of life, from healthcare to psychiatry, to the environment, to the workplace, to the school, or even to personal relationships. It is one of the leading theories of educational psychology. So thousands of research articles have been done on this, and it proposes a very clear framework for understanding the psychological needs of people, including students, and how to motivate them. So it is very much used in education as well, which is mainly what we're going to be looking at this semester. Okay, so let's have a look at the theory in a very basic way. So you can see from the diagram behind me that self-determination theory basically says that there are 3 core elements, 3 core components of the theory, and these are 3 basic human psychological needs. So they are the need for autonomy, the need for relatedness, and the need for competence. So we are going to look at all 3 of these. The theory proposes that when we have autonomy, competence, and relatedness, so when our basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness are met by the environment, then intrinsic motivation will increase. So intrinsic motivation is quite important here. So 2 things maybe to think about. So intrinsic motivation is motivation that is controlled by the individual. So in this case, the student, the motivation comes from the student. So the motivation is not being controlled by the teacher or by the authority figure or by rules and regulations. Okay, so we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later on. The second way to think about intrinsic motivation is that it comes from the task that the student or the person is doing. Okay, so it's intrinsic to the task in some ways, and it's also intrinsic to the student. Okay, we will look at this in a little bit more detail as we move through the presentation today. So let's move on and let's look at the first of the core components, which is autonomy. Autonomy is having choice about what you do. And simply, if you have choice about what you do, then you will be more motivated to do that thing. Why? Because you decided to do it. So let's take a very simple example, like on the PowerPoint, the student is reading books. Um, if I say to you, you must read this book, and you must read this book by next week, and then you must write an essay about the book, and you must write the essay that I tell you to write about the book. So this is not an example of autonomy. Autonomy would be you choosing to read the book and then you choosing to write about a topic that interests you based on that book. Okay, so I think you can see in the first example, the teacher in this case is deciding what the student reads and also deciding what the student should write about. In the second case, the student has autonomy because they are deciding the book that they want to read and they are deciding what they want to write about. So the motivation or the choice is coming from the student. Okay, of course, it's about the student's interest and something that the student wants to do instead of something that the teacher wants them to do. So that's a very simple explanation of autonomy. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look at how autonomy works in the real world. So a few years ago, when the internet was in its earlier stages, Microsoft had a huge project called Microsoft Encarta. So they wanted to build the world's leading encyclopedia, the world's leading online encyclopedia, and they paid people a lot of money to do this. However, nobody uses, or very few people even know about Microsoft Encarta today. This is because Wikipedia became the world's most used encyclopedia. But the strange thing about Wikipedia is nobody gets paid to do it, right? So it's very contrary to the way we understand work. You pay somebody to work and they are motivated to work. So pay is an external form of motivation or behavior regulation. We normally think in this way, I pay you to work, I pay you more money, you work harder. But this is not actually how it works. People need a minimum amount of money. Sure, they need to be comfortable, but actually paying people more and more money doesn't motivate people more and more. So what the example of Wikipedia shows you is the power of autonomy or the power of intrinsic motivation. So if you're thinking that autonomy and intrinsic motivation are quite similar, then they are in some respects. So don't worry too much about that. The important thing here is that people are doing it because they are interested in it. They're doing it because they love it. So Wikipedia is mainly, of course, made by people giving up their own time freely, editing and writing pages because they're interested in those pages. This is the power of autonomy. They're choosing to do it, okay? And they're choosing to do it because they're interested in doing it. So let's have a look at the education setting in a bit more detail and look at what learner autonomy is. So if you look at the PowerPoint behind me, you can see that the student has various choices about time, study contents represented in the book, maybe the artist's palette shows you the choice of subject. So this PowerPoint shows you the idea of choice, okay? So the student is given choices within the educational context or educational environment. Let's have a look at some of these choices. First, you may have a choice about what subjects to study. So I think you have this choice with your university modules and subjects. Um, you have some choice at least. Having a choice about which books and assignments to read or which topics to study. Having a choice about when you study. So you guys don't get this so much, but in Finland, I think the student can choose when and how they study during the school day. So if they just feel like chilling out, listening to music for an hour or two, the teacher is not going to say anything. The important thing is that they finish whatever work they need to do by a specific deadline, let's say at the end of the week. How they choose to get there is the student's own decision. So the student is learning about themselves. The student is learning how to manage their time responsibly without the teacher telling them what to do and when to do it. Also, with a system that has real autonomy, attendance in classes would not be compulsory. So you may be thinking I'm going to say that attendance is not compulsory in this course, but unfortunately, I can't say that. But I will give you some autonomy about how and when we study, as you will find out later in the course. So it's flexibility about time, even flexibility about attendance. So when I did my university degree, actually, I didn't have to attend the lectures. Nobody did an attendance check. I could decide whether to go or not. All I needed to do was get the reading list from the tutor, and then I would just meet the tutor once every week. I would tell him what subject I wanted to study, him or her. They would recommend some books for me to go and read. I would go and read them, write the essay, read it to the tutor, and then we discuss it. So this is actually a very good education system, I think, because it builds autonomy. Okay, so let's move on and let's have a look at a simple question to understand autonomy. What would you like to do? So what would you like to learn? What would you like to study? What are your goals? Now, I think in many ways this question is useful, but it's also too simple in understanding autonomy. Because if I ask you what you want to do, then you might say, well, actually, Russell, what I want to do is not attend your class. What I want is to get an A plus grade without submitting any assignments. And maybe I'm thinking, well, what I want to do is stay at home. So you can see that actually it's too simple just to say that autonomy is what you want to do. So how do we think about autonomy in an educational environment? Because of course an educational environment has lots of rules. So rules about attendance set by the Korean Board of Education, Ministry of Education, this kind of thing. So what does it actually mean in a setting where you must attend and you must do examinations, this kind of thing? You must submit assignments. What does autonomy really mean in this context? Okay, so we can think about people, and in this case, students, as having different levels of motivation along a continuum. So it's called a self-determination continuum. So self-determination really means how the student is able to make choices about what they do and also to understand the reasons for those choices. Um, so if we look at the black part here, really the student has no motivation at all. And this can happen in the classroom setting. We move to the red part and we can see that the motivation is mainly external. So it says compliance, external rewards and punishments. So this is very common, I think, in the education system. And it's a very common way of understanding or a very common practice of how students should be motivated. So there are rules that you need to follow. The teacher sets those rules, and there are rewards and punishments. So essentially grades. Okay, a grade is a reward for studying hard. And maybe a punishment, of course, is very common in education, and very common also among young children, especially. So I'm not saying that there is never a place for any form of external regulation, but just external regulation is when your behavior is controlled by rules or when your behavior is controlled by another person. So in the case of a child, the parent is often controlling or trying to control the child's behavior. And of course, also teachers do this as well. So generally, authority figures are controlling your behavior. So this, of course, is a very common feature of society. All societies have rules and regulations. But how can we think about this in a more intelligent way? So if we notice the comment at the bottom of the PowerPoint, it says the student moves from left to right along the continuum by internalizing the reason or value for their behavior. So internalizing means first understanding the reason for something. So if we look at, let's say, the third one, the yellow one, the orange and yellow ones, it says somewhat external and somewhat internal. So here, the student is beginning to understand the reasons for the regulations as they exist. At this point, the student starts to develop more self-determination because they can understand the reason for the rule or the regulation. So let's think about driving a car, for example. So if I stop at the crossing, the pedestrian crossing, the crossing across the street, if I stop there simply because I don't want to break a law, then I don't really understand why I should stop at the crossing. Um, the reason I should stop at the crossing is to keep other people safe, right? But I noticed that many people, for example, will drive across the crossing when the light is on green in order to save themselves a few seconds. I don't think they really understand why the regulation is there. So I would say that in this case, the person is well, the person is not even following external regulations, but so it's non-regulation on this system. But if I stop at the crossing simply because I don't want to break the law, then this is external regulation. If I stop there willingly because I understand that the other person's safety is the important thing, then I'm moving along this continuum towards intrinsically motivated behavior. Why? Because I understand the reason for the things that I am doing. So this, of course, is very important in education. Young children start out just following regulations, but people who develop more, let's say, intrinsic motivation or more self-determination, they begin to understand the reasons why these regulations exist. So this is what's going on here. The student is understanding, and by internalizing, we actually mean changing our behavior. So we can say that we understand the reason for the rule and we make our behavior congruent with that. And then eventually, at the final stage, with intrinsic motivation, we develop interest, enjoyment, and satisfaction in the work that we do. And here we're achieving a state of well-being, which is essentially the goal of self-determination theory. So let's move on and let's look at autonomy support. So really, autonomy is not the concept that you need to understand as a teacher. From the student's point of view, it's about having more autonomy and having more autonomy within a context of rules in the case of education. So understanding the reasons for the rules, as I said, allows you to develop more autonomy or more self-direction. If you think about the case of a child learning to ride a bicycle, you don't simply allow the student autonomy, the child autonomy, and say, okay, go and ride in the street where it's very busy with cars, and you stay at home and just hope that your child comes home alive. That would be autonomy in a sense. But what you need as a teacher or a parent or even a friend is autonomy support. Okay, so the other person has something that they want to do, and you support them in doing it. So this is the important thing. So the role of the teacher is to support autonomy in the student. So we're going to look at this a little bit more in the presentation. There's also a video about how to do this as a teacher that I will share with you. But if you can look at the PowerPoint for a moment, you can see that the parent is supporting the autonomy of the child learning to ride a bicycle. So the parent is giving them a helping hand, helping them to balance, helping them to steer, making sure that they're able to ride in a reasonably successful way, and then they will let go. And then the student or here the cyclist will have autonomy, and then they will be doing it for themselves. So this is what's important here. It's autonomy support until the person can become autonomous and do it for themselves. Okay, so one final thing about autonomy. Are we just talking about individualism here? And I would say no. Okay, so often people talk about the individual and the collective, especially when they talk about things like Western culture and Eastern culture. But autonomy is not simply the same as individualism. Autonomy is different from individualism because if I'm autonomous, I can autonomously choose to be part of a collective group, right? And I think this is part of our common experience. So you have a group of people over there, and maybe you think, I don't like the way they're behaving, I will avoid them. So you're autonomously choosing not to be part of that group. Another group of students in the classroom, maybe you hear some funny jokes or you like the way they're interacting, and you think, maybe I will choose to be part of that group. So this is autonomy rather than individualism. I'm choosing to be part of a group. I'm choosing to follow the rules or conventions of my society. So I'm opting in, if you like. And this is what autonomy is really about. I'm choosing what I want to do. So I can either choose to be an individual apart from the group, or I can choose to be part of the group, part of the collective. So this is really how autonomy differs simply from individualism. So let's move on and look at the second one of these, which is competence. So competence is basically learning skills. So you can see in the picture behind me, we have the different levels of competence from amateur to master. So if you are very, very competent at something, we can say that you're an expert, a master, or highly skilled. So competence is really about knowing how to do something well. So it's about knowing how to acquire the skills that you need to do what you need to do successfully. So competence is about tasks. So if we're talking about the classroom, you give students a task or a project to do. Also, it's about the right level of challenge. So you need to give something just above the student's current level of ability, and hopefully something that the student can see is worth learning. So it's also about challenge in that respect. Competence is also therefore about building confidence. So you're learning new skills step by step. You can see that those skills are useful for you to acquire, and therefore your confidence and your motivation will increase. So let's move on and look at competence as a simple question. So this time, I think the question is, can you do it? Okay, so anytime we think about this question, can you do it? We're thinking about competence. So I might say, here is an example of an excellent essay. The student got an A plus grade. Maybe we look at the reasons why, like the structural elements of the essay, the way the text is organized. And then the question is, can you do it? So this is different from saying simply, here is an essay, I want you to do it. Because in this sentence or in this example, I'm the one who is deciding the motivation, or I'm the one who's controlling the motivation. So the motivation is coming from outside. But if I say, can you do it? Then the voice comes from within. Okay, so maybe you say, no, I can't do it, and you give up. But hopefully, in most cases, there'll be a little voice saying, yes, I can do it, or yes, I want to do it. So this is intrinsic motivation in this case. Okay, so how does competence change education and the way we do education? So I think it shifts the focus from simply knowing information or knowing facts to learning and acquiring new skills and applying or using those skills. So, for example, if we think about the past in your culture, and we had the civil servants exams in China and also Korea, and you can see the Yangban. Hopefully, it's a correct image of a Yangban in the picture. So these kind of guys, they needed to memorize lots of information. So they needed to know things. They needed to know information. These days, also because of the change in media that we use, now everything is online. It's more useful not to know the information because the information is already there. We don't need to memorize it. The useful thing is to know how to understand that information, how to evaluate that information, and then how to use that information in order to create your own work. Okay, so it could be an essay, as we will do in this course, or a presentation, as we will do in this course, or maybe anything like a video on YouTube. So this is the useful skill now. It's how to do that thing, how to create. So you're becoming a creator in the modern age. Okay, so let's move on and let's see this in the context of Western philosophy very quickly. So there has been a big change in Western philosophy, and it does reflect this basic change that I'm talking about. So with the Greeks, and also up until, let's say, the 20th century, I think, the important question was, what is true knowledge and how do we know it? So this is two things in philosophy called ontology and epistemology. So what is real, what really exists, and how can we study that in a methodical way? But the direction of philosophy has changed, not only in pragmatism, but largely in American pragmatism. A nice example here is John Dewey talking about education. He said, give the pupil something to do, not something to learn. And the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally results. So we move towards a task-based or project-based system of education. And in pragmatism, what is true is what works in practice. So if we think about the old way of doing philosophy, let's talk about a big question like God, does God exist? The important thing was to know whether this was true knowledge or not, and know how we could know that. But with pragmatism, the important question would be something like, well, if believing in God is good for the person, then it's true. Okay, if it helps the person to develop a higher level of well-being, then God is true. So what is true is what works in practice. John Dewey's theory of education is called learning by doing. So you may want to study that in more detail this semester. So I think this is nicely summarized in the quote below. So competence and knowledge, or competence versus knowledge, knowing and knowing what to do about it are two different things. We might also think about this as knowing something, and knowing how to do something. And competence is knowing how to do something. Okay, let's finally move on to relatedness as the third of the core elements of self-determination theory. And this is the easiest one to understand. Relatedness is simply a connection to other people and a connection to the place or environment that you are in. So I think all of us can understand this very quickly. Relatedness is a positive emotional connection to the people you are with and the environment that you are in. So everybody has been in a classroom where they were not connected, where they didn't feel a connection to the students and the teacher. And hopefully some of you have also been in a classroom where you did feel like you belonged. Simple question here to think about relatedness is, how do you feel? I think you can see the guy in the picture maybe is not feeling too good in his class, unfortunately, not feeling too much connectedness or relatedness. Let's look at some very clear and obvious examples of relatedness in education. So group-based learning or cooperative learning. So here you're obviously learning not only the information related to the course, but you're learning how to build relationships, and hopefully you're getting emotional support from communicating with the other people in the group. University clubs and societies obviously is relatedness. Also, it's about being connected not only to the students in the group, but to the teacher. So is the teacher open to you? Is the teacher listening to you? Is the teacher trying to help you in a sincere way? And also it's about the wider university. So we saw this with clubs and societies, but also things like counseling services. So if you're having a hard time, if you need somebody to talk to, the university has a counselor, and this helps you to understand that they value you, that your well-being is important. So it's also about the bigger environment and not just the classroom environment. Essentially, it involves feeling like you matter. Okay, people feel like you are important. And of course, this is probably the most important thing of all. Okay, so let's have a look finally at the claims that self-determination theory makes, the scientific claims that it makes. So first of all, what does it say about performance? Well, actually, in terms of performance, people can become excellent at doing something if they are extrinsically motivated or if they are intrinsically motivated. So, in terms of the level of mastery, the level of skill, then people can achieve great success using or having either form of motivation. So you might wonder, what's the point of all this then? Well, the point is that extrinsic motivation breaks down. So let's think about the example of a genius piano player. Okay, he doesn't really like playing the piano. This person was forced to do it from a very early age. His parent, let's say his father, demanded that he played the piano. He practiced 8 or 10 hours a day, reached a level of a concert pianist, but he never really understood the value of what he was doing because his motivation was controlled by his fear of his father, let's say. His father dies. Suddenly, he loses direction and purpose. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he gives up playing the piano, even though he's a master of piano playing. So I think everybody knows about this kind of story, a brilliant person who suddenly gives up, or let's say a brilliant person who commits suicide. So these types of things show you the dangers of extrinsic motivation. However, if the person is intrinsically motivated to do something, they will enjoy doing what they're doing. This is the important thing. And because they enjoy doing what they're doing, their motivation is stable. It will not break down. So this is the claim that self-determination theory makes. Intrinsic motivation is stable. Also, the person, because they enjoy doing what they're doing, will not focus too much on external things like achieving success, achieving social status, gaining acceptance and approval from others. They will focus more on the joy of the activity. So if they don't get the outcome that they want, if they don't get the awards and the recognition, they still had an enjoyable life because they still valued the process. They still did something that they wanted to do. They understood the reasons for doing what they were doing, and they felt supported in doing what they did. Okay, so let's wrap up this talk about self-determination theory by going back to the question that I asked at the start. And the question was, how can I motivate my students? Now, if you think about this, everything I've been saying leads us to the conclusion that this is actually the wrong question to ask. So if you're thinking in this way, how can I motivate my students? Then you haven't really understood the presentation. This is a question that a controlling teacher asks. How can I give them motivation? How can I control their motivation? But according to self-determination theory, this is the wrong way to think about it. People motivate themselves. You can never control somebody else's emotion or motivation. The real question to ask is, how can I create an environment? How can I create conditions in which their natural motivation grows? And the answer I've been trying to present to you today is through autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So let's look at that one more time. Autonomy is giving them as much choice as you can within the framework. Two, competence is enabling them to learn the know-how and the skills that will be useful to them in their life in achieving what they autonomously want to do. And three, relatedness is making sure that they feel an emotional connection, emotional warmth within the environment that they're in. And if we have all three of these things, then the students' self-determination, their self-direction, their internal motivation will increase. They will become happier people, and they will have a stable form of motivation which can help them to continue along the path to personal fulfillment and to personal success. So let's wrap it all up by reviewing what we talked about today. We looked first at what self-determination theory was, then we looked at what autonomy was, then we looked at competence and relatedness, and finally we looked at some of the scientific claims of self-determination theory and whether and how it improves our performance. So thanks very much for watching my presentation today on self-determination theory. These are some of the links I used to make the presentation. So thanks very much, everybody, and see you all soon in the classroom if you're watching this at home. Okay, bye-bye.